Long before the peal of thunder and the flash of lightning announced the downpour of rain, forces have been at work in the heavens to produce a storm. Long before the outbreak of the Civil War, events had been slowly tending toward the inevitable conflict. With the first slaves introduced upon American soil began the conditions which brought about the final tragedy. Well, we're studying the Civil War, 1850 to 1865, and the dates of the actual war are from April 1861 to April 1865. But 1850 is a good starting point because this is when the pressures around slavery and taxation and the possibility of secession began to mount. And so we talked about it last week. The immediate cause of the Civil War was slavery. Slavery had been instituted way back in the 17th century. It had been avoided pretty much. The trouble or the problem with slavery had been avoided pretty much when they wrote the Constitution. But here we are, just less than, 7 years later, and now it has finally led to the Civil War. I want to define a couple of things before we go on from last week. We talked about slavery last week and states' rights last week. I wanted to give you a couple of definitions. First of all, slavery. Slavery and enslavement are both the state and the condition of being a slave, who is someone forbidden to quit their service for another person and is treated as property. Treated as property. Slavery relies heavily on the enslaved person being intimidated either by the threat of violence or some other method of abuse. That's a good definition for slavery. Here's a definition for states' rights, another reason that the Civil War may have broken out, but maybe something that was highlighted because of the Civil War. But here's a definition. In American political discourse, states' rights are political powers held for the state governments rather than the federal government according to the United States Constitution. So states' rights are the powers that the states have in counterbalance to the powers that the federal government has. This is all based in the 10th the 10th Amendment. And here's the 10th Amendment. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states, respectively, or to the people. In other words, if it's not specifically listed in the Constitution of the United States, the federal government does not have power in that arena. And unless it's prohibited for the states to take power in any particular area, the states have power in all those areas not mentioned. So, slavery, the immediate primary cause, but something that you have to think about along beside slavery, because the end of the Civil War brought this balance between the federal government and the state government to an imbalance. So one other thing I would like to point out about slavery is there are two different approaches to the abolition of slavery. If you'll look over here on in the text, it talks about the effect of abolitionism, or abolition. Abolitionism means to abolish. And in the context of American slavery, there were people who wanted to end slavery by an edict. There was another approach, though, and if you look at the top of the page here, Henry Clay had been president of the American Colonization Society, and he had advocated a system of gradual emancipation, which meant they wanted to phase slavery out, usually over 25 years. Any slave born would be set free in 25 years. And according to certain plans, in 25 years, then slavery would have ended. So two different approaches. And it was the abolitionist approach that really sort of incensed the South. When South Carolina seceded, their reasons for seceding was because Abraham Lincoln was an abolitionist and he had been elected as president. They stated that as their primary reason for seceding from the Union. So let's go ahead and let's move on down to the next chapter. Well, before we do, let me point this out very quickly, and I'm not going to say anything else about it. If you read through this page right here, you're going to get a perspective of the freed slaves, or the slaves as they were under slavery. The lady who wrote the book, Elizabeth Kincaid, was an educator, and this would be the typical view of slaves and then freed slaves. It would not be our view today, that's for sure. And I believe any modern educator that read this page would be a little bit, if not a whole lot, just scandalized at the condescending way in which she speaks about African Americans. However, you have to understand that even Abraham Lincoln himself would have used this same language. So it was a different time, a different place, and we just need to extend them grace, but understand that we certainly don't need to have these same attitudes or thoughts about African Americans. Well, let's go on to the next chapter pretty quickly. The first thing you're going to notice when you get to chapter 15 is this, that there's a big picture of Abraham Lincoln. And something that I think is interesting is Kentucky, small state that we are, we have had 3 different presidents. Abraham Lincoln, Zachary Taylor, and then Jefferson Davis, who was the president of the Confederate States of America. And he was really the only president the Confederate States ever had. Kentuckians used to be more proud of that idea or that fact, but all of the Southern generals, all of the Southern heroes are falling into more ill repute these days. I'll leave that to you and your parents to talk about that. But we do have 3 presidents. Zachary Taylor is buried up in Louisville, and you could go and see his monument. Here it is, that is right outside of Louisville, and he is buried there. He only served for about a year and a half. He died in office probably from food poisoning, but we're much more proud of Abraham Lincoln, who, let's see, I don't know if we have his dates up here. Yeah, Zachary Taylor lived from 1784 to 1850, and he was the 12th president of the United States. Abraham Lincoln was the 15th president of the United States. And so you can see Abraham Lincoln everywhere. Here he is in the Rotunda over in Frankfort. Here is the place he grew up outside of Louisville over at Knob Creek. And here's the sort of the stone building that they've built there. But here is the actual cabin inside that building. And then if you go over near Elizabethtown, a place called Hodgenville, you can find this cabin. And it is the cabin that is a replica of where Lincoln was actually born. So everywhere you go, you can see Lincoln. And if you see him here again in the Rotunda, I don't know if you've ever noticed before, but who is this over here? Anybody? Jefferson Davis. That monument is no longer there. They have moved it down to the Jefferson Davis Memorial down in South Central Kentucky. And that monument is very similar to the Washington Monument. And from a distance, it seems almost as massive. It's not, but it is pretty massive. They have moved the monument that used to be in the Rotunda to, there's a building over here that they placed it in. And so if you ever go down there, you'll be able to see both. Well, let's go ahead and go on to the next chapter. Just keep in mind that we had 3 presidents. Another thing you might want to know, since we used to be part of Virginia, is that we also had 8 different presidents from Virginia as well. So between Virginia and Kentucky, we've had 10 presidents of the United States out of about 45. That's pretty impressive, I think. Even to have 2 from our little state is impressive. Okay, well, it goes on here and it talks about the beginning of the war. Here's what happened. Abraham Lincoln got elected. South Carolina seceded. They seceded because Abraham Lincoln had vowed that he would abolish slavery. After they seceded, 6 other states followed: Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. After this next event, which we're going to talk about, the firing on Fort Sumter, or the attempt to resupply Fort Sumter, 3 more states seceded: Virginia, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Arkansas. And you can see on this map right here the almost exact line between the South and the North. These states right here are the border states, and so if you look, you can see that there is Maryland, West Virginia, Kentucky, and Missouri. All of those were border states where slavery continued to the end of the war. Halfway through the war, Abraham Lincoln outlawed the institution of slavery. It was called the Emancipation Proclamation. But, so, South Carolina secedes because of Lincoln. These others follow, and then Lincoln, and I believe the previous president as well, they wanted to seize all of the federal buildings, federal properties down in these red states. That would include the forts, the prisons, and various other places. And so, in Charleston, South Carolina, there was a colonel named Anderson who decided that he was not going to relinquish the federal fort that he was supposed to be in charge of. Originally, he was at Fort Moultrie, but when this all got started, he spiked all of the cannons, which means he plugged them up, and then he burned their wheels and everything that they were standing on so that you couldn't use them, and then he moved all of his troops over to another fort there on the bay, which was much more easy to defend, and that was Fort Sumter. And so at Fort Sumter, we have the first shots of the Civil War. Basically what happened, Lincoln threatened to resupply the Confederates, and this was really South Carolina because the Confederate Army hadn't been gathered yet. It hadn't even been instituted. It was just South Carolina's home guard. They said, if you try to supply it, we will fire on the fort. Well, they sent the ships to resupply. The ship was stopped, but they began to fire on the fort. Fortunately, no one was killed in that initial skirmish. One guy did die when they were leaving, but it was through an accident. So as I understand it, and I can be corrected, you can ask my friend Ernie Saker, who will be here to lecture on Monday. But as I understand it, as the Union troops left, the Confederate troops lined the street and stood at attention as they left with great respect. I think those men engaged in the skirmish, they were enlisted men, and I think they had a great respect for one another. That changes as the war presses on because it lasted much longer than anyone thought. And by the end of the war, it was much more gruesome and much more treacherous. So that's sort of the beginning of the war. Lincoln is elected. South Carolina secedes. Others follow. The federal government tries to reclaim their forts. The South refuses to let them come into their state and take those forts. Boom, it takes off. Here's Jefferson Davis. He was the president of the Confederate States of America, and he was originally under I believe it was Pierce. He was the Secretary of War, and he was also a senator in the federal government, the U.S. Senate, when the war broke out. But they recruited him. He would much rather have been the Secretary of War for the Confederates or to have led the Confederate Army. But instead, they felt like they needed his education and his abilities to lead as the president of those Confederate states. So, one of the things about Kentucky, and it's interesting that Jefferson Davis and Abraham Lincoln were born just 80 miles apart. Jefferson left when he was, I think, 3 years old. Lincoln left when he was just barely moving toward a teenager. And Davis went south, Mississippi. Lincoln went north, Indiana, and then Illinois. And actually, their lives were shaped and formed in different cultures, which is why they ended up being presidents of where they were president. All right. So as it breaks out, you can see that America is divided, but these middle states, if you'll look, Kentucky being one of them, is actually divided itself. Originally, what Kentucky wanted to do, you can read it right here, mediatorial neutrality. Mediatorial neutrality. Basically what that meant is, in the beginning, the Kentuckians told the federal government, told the seceded states, look, we are not going to enter this war. We are going to fire on anybody who crosses our lines. Well, that didn't last very long into the war because the Confederates came north, the North came south, and before you know it, Kentucky was forced to take a side, and indeed they did become aligned with the Union. But before that happened, or as that was happening, the state was very divided on several fronts. Here is a cartoon that appeared in one of the newspapers making fun of mediatorial neutrality. As you can see, it says Kentucky cat fight. There's the cat. That's Magoffin. He was the governor. Neutrality means holding the cock of the walk. So there's the cock of the walk is the rooster who kind of guards the hens. While the Confederate cat, Jeff Davis, kills off his chickens. So this is the North, and while Kentucky is keeping the North from coming to the South is actually continuing to inhabit what the North thought was federal lands and to live contrary to what they believed was the right thing to do. So these were the kinds of things that would appear in the newspapers. And here's a quote. Situated between 3 slave states and 3 free, connected by railroad arteries into Tennessee and Ohio, north and south, and bounded by rivers accessing the deep south and the east coast, Kentucky was where north and south converged, where they touched one another most intimately. And the fact that they touched each other most intimately means that there was a very mixed culture here, and people ended up having to take sides. So let's keep moving through. Let's go down to the next chapter. I believe it's chapter 16 is next. Yeah, chapter 16. So let's see. Oh yeah, I wanted to point out one more place about the division. To me, this is probably one of the most difficult things. So now war has come to Kentucky. Families have chosen sides, and the pain of war has torn Kentucky families apart, from the smallest farmhouse all the way to the White House. So I know you'll notice these names. You'll remember these names because we walked through them. We've seen these names as we've gone through Kentucky history to this point. These are the famous families. The Clay family. Okay, Henry Clay is the one who kind of put the war off through his compromises. But here you see Henry Clay III was a Union officer. Lieutenant James B. Clay was in the Confederate States of America, and James B. Clay allied himself with the Confederacy and raised troops for Bragg. So Clay had a Union officer and 2 Confederate States sympathizers. Here's the Breckinridge family, another famous family. Breckinridge was a senator and a vice president. The Breckinridge family had always been a prominent Kentucky family. Breckinridge County, Kentucky is named for John Breckinridge. But here's his descendants. He was a United States Senator when the Civil War broke out. He resigned his office, left the Union, and joined the Confederacy. He would command the Confederate regiment called the Orphan Brigade. Here he is. And then Joseph C. Breckinridge was a Union officer. And then Reverend Robert Breckinridge, he was the uncle of John Breckinridge, and Joseph was John's cousin, was a Union supporter. So there's the Breckinridges. The Crittenden family, same thing. His sons, one fought for the South, another fought for the North. The Prentiss family isn't as famous, but he had one served in the Confederate Army, the other served in the Confederate Army and died in the Battle of Augusta, Georgia. But he was a strong supporter. George Prentiss, he was an editor of the daily newspaper in Louisville. He was a strong Unionist, and his paper really supported the Union. The Lincoln family, Abraham Lincoln, okay, Ben Helm was Mary's sister's husband. He died in 1863. President Lincoln was very close to him. He was in the Confederate States of America Army, though. Also, David Todd was in the Confederate States. But he was Mary's brother. This caused the Lincolns a lot of trouble because Mary Todd had so many of hers in the Southern Army. And so it is a nation divided. In hundreds of families, brother was involved, indeed pitted against brother and father against son. The divided family was a reality and a symbol of a divided nation. The effects of the Civil War on the family were long-lasting, and many aspects of everyday family life for generations were strained even after the fighting stopped. You can imagine if you had fought for the South or the North and you came back to Kentucky and you had to live together with your sibling. Here's another account that I think probably captures more than anything what went on here in Kentucky. Sometime during a battle at Perryville, and we will talk about the Battle of Perryville soon, in October of 1862, the Battle of Perryville in 1862, it was the last battle fought in Kentucky. 2 opposing regiments from that state being Kentucky, exchanged gunfire. Among them was a soldier with the last name Hopkins. Hopkins stood only 20 feet away from a group of enemy soldiers when he aimed, fired, and mortally wounded a soldier, who, it turned out, was his own brother. It was no tragic coincidence. According to the Louisville Daily Journal, immediately after shooting him, Hopkins approached his brother and told him that he had done it on purpose. Then he gave him water and a blanket and left soon after. Later that day, however, Hopkins returned to the scene of the fight and stayed with his ailing brother for half the night. And the paper explained Hopkins' actions by saying that he was a man of the family, or a family man. So we see as it breaks out, it divides the state. And it's interesting, one other fact that I would like to point out is that Kentucky had 2 standing guards. They had the State Guard and the Home Guard. The Home Guard was not as disciplined. And so when the war broke out, the Home Guard sided with the North. The State Guard, on the other hand, sided with the South. John Hunt Morgan was part of the State Guard. He didn't enlist immediately, but we'll talk about him later as well. But he was part of the State Guard. Many of them turned their guns back in because they did not want to take arms from their state since they were leaving it. But a lot of them kept their guns too. And then you can read about the Home Guard here. It tells you they were less disciplined and they probably weren't as good as soldiers. So there you go. That's sort of a quick overview of these chapters. I hope you've enjoyed them. In class on Monday, my good friend Ernie Saker is going to guest lecture. He loves Kentucky. I call him Mr. Lexington. He was born here, went to Bryan Station High School, and he knows so much about our city. He and I are members of the Kentucky Civil War Roundtable together. And I just enjoy talking with him and hearing him talk about it. So you will really enjoy class on Monday. All right, let me just go back through and highlight real quick. Slavery is when someone cannot leave their service and they are intimidated through either violence or some other abuse. States' rights, all rights that are not delineated in the Constitution abide in the state or the people. We've had 3 presidents: Zachary Taylor, Abraham Lincoln, Jefferson Davis. You can see their monuments if you travel throughout the state. Secession, and by the way, it's S-E-C-E-D-E, not S-U-C-C-E-S-S. It means to separate. And we had 11, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 states that seceded to form the Confederate States of America. Broke out at Fort Sumter, where Colonel Anderson, by the way, I don't know if I told you that Anderson was a Kentuckian from a military family. His father had served in the Revolutionary War as an aide-de-camp to the Marquis de Lafayette. And so he probably knew the Marquis de Lafayette. And he went on in the Civil War to serve in various places. He even oversaw the army that was in Kentucky for a while. We wanted to maintain mediatorial neutrality, but through a series of events we were unable to. And the war, if you're going to know anything else about the Civil War in Kentucky, we need to understand that we were divided. We had about 40,000 men enlist in the Confederate armies. Conversely, there were about 90,000 to 100,000 who invested or who joined the armies of the North. But of course, because we were still part of the Union, they were required to join, and the president could actually conscript them into the army. The South, it was all volunteer. And so that shows you the deep, deep division that was in our state. Well, I told you before, this is the war of all wars that I hate with a passion. I get upset when we talk about it. What led to it should have never happened, but even the war itself, even given the circumstances, should have been put off. There's always a better way than picking up arms. But that's what happened, and that's what we're studying. So keep reading, enjoy class on Wednesday, and then the next time we get together, we will go ahead and talk about some of the actual battles that take place in Kentucky. God bless you. I will see you in a week.